All right, tell me. Oh, looks like it's recording. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marshall McDaniel, and I have the honor to host this afternoon's conversation about carbon. And our honored guest today is Chad Hart. Chad Hart was born and raised in Southwest Missouri, and his parents raised a few cattle and operated a small meat locker. Chad received his BS in economics with minors in mathematics, history, and astronomy from Southwest Missouri State University in 1991. He moved to Iowa in the summer of 1991 to pursue grad education and received a PhD in economics and statistics in 1999 from ISU. Chad then joined the economics faculty in 2008, and Chad's research has examined the interaction between agriculture commitments with the World Trade Organization and agricultural policies and programs of the WTO members, covers crop insurance, international aid, biofuel policy, federal agriculture policy, and crop marketing. What doesn't Chad cover? Chad is also a partner in Farm Risk, an Iowa firm that develops revenue insurance products and receives revenue based on policies sold by crop insurance companies. You might know him best, or at least I do, from frequent appearances on Iowa Public Radio or PBS's Iowa Press. So I was glad to meet him last week on virtually, at least. And I also wanted to mention before we get started on this conversation that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and we'll get to them in about 20 minutes. But for now, just Chad and I are gonna have a conversation. And so I'm excited to converse with Chad about carbon markets. So I think we should get started with just what is a carbon credit and what is a carbon market, Chad?
Oh, you give me a fun one, Marshall.
And hold on 1 second, Chad. Marshall, can you pull down your screen, please? Pull down your shared screen so we can see both of you.
Oh, pull down my shared screen?
Yep.
Oh, so now
just sharing.
Unshare. Yeah. There we go. Go ahead.
Now people disappeared on me. I got to find this again. There we are. So yeah, my pleasure to be with everybody today, especially Marshall here as my guest or host. As we're looking at, what is a carbon credit and, carbon market? Carbon credit is defined as sort of I'll call it a permit, a certificate, something that we can trade that basically establishes the right to emit or utilize a unit of carbon. And in this case, the way it's usually measured is that it's measured in tons of carbon dioxide or the equivalent amount of a greenhouse gas. And so when we're looking at carbon markets, they have been around for a while. These discussions actually started back in the early 2000s that I know of. And we've seen at least a couple of runs at trying to create carbon markets previously. A few of those have gotten at least a little bit of a foothold, but what we're seeing right now is a tremendous surge in not only, I would say, public interest in broadening those markets, but also private interest wanting to be involved here. And agriculture becomes one of those, I would say, natural industries to look at, just because when you look at sort of the overall carbon footprint, it's estimated, at least I know, EPA estimated here within the US, that agriculture represents about 10% of the nation's footprint. And so it makes sense that agriculture becomes one of those industries that is looked at very closely as we try to develop carbon markets here in the US.
So Chad, I have a follow-up question, and I know there was maybe the last carbon market was between 2008 and 2010. Can you tell us what happened there and why we're getting deja vu all over again with carbon market excitement?
Sure. So Marshall knows I have a slide for this that basically has the poster for Back to the Future on it. One of my first talks as an extension economist here at Iowa State was back in 2008, and it was the initial run-up that I really remember participating in the carbon markets. And it was the excitement around, we were seeing a lot of federal legislation coming down in terms of looking at biorenewable products and looking at greenhouse gas emissions. And there was that, sort of excitement around international agreements that could be reached and ultimately did lead to things like the Paris Protocol that we ended up with. But within that first initial wave, you did have Congress, for example, propose some legislation to look at greenhouse gas emissions, trying to figure out federal programs that would either help create some of these carbon markets or at least put some bounds upon them. And I remember, like I say, doing several extension meetings back at the time, laying out what those might mean for farmers here across the state of Iowa. And we did see some action there. For example, Iowa Farm Bureau helped create a company called Aggregate, which did sign farmers up in carbon markets, under contracts, doing certain practices for a 3 to 5 year window. That played itself out though, and by the time we got to say 2012 and 2013, the markets had basically sort of died off due to neglect. While they got started, they didn't find the momentum to stick around and build. And so we saw those sort of disappear along with the federal interest in them at the time.
Thanks for that information. That's helpful. So that was a bit about what happened in the past. Can you tell us where the current carbon markets are at? And I know you and I both use this term as the Wild West. I mean, I have trouble keeping up on what companies are doing what because things are changing so rapidly. Can you give our audience kind of a broad outlook at where you see things now, and then maybe also then talk about my second part of that question is talk a little bit about the contracts and differences amongst all the companies that are important for people to know?
I'll do the best I can, but yeah, Marshall, I think you pinned it right with the Wild West. I think as we look right now, like I say, there's a lot of private company interest in helping develop carbon markets. And we know of at least, I know of at least 4 major efforts, if not 6, that are trying to actively sign farmers up for some sort of carbon markets, whether it's, we've heard groups like a NORI, Indigo Ag, the Soil and Water Outcomes Group. I know Bear Science is working on one. So you're seeing all sorts of companies work to build something in this space. The reason we're calling, I'd say, the Wild West is because each company is taking a different approach to how they're setting up their contracts and how they're sort of laying out what their carbon market might look like. That, I think, is the big struggle that arguably we had about a decade ago when we first tried to make a run at carbon markets. And what we're seeing right now is that there's not a firm definition, if you will, of what a carbon market truly is, what practices count or what doesn't count, what are the outcomes that we're searching for. And so without a lot of that standardization in the contract, it becomes very hard for that market to truly succeed or build momentum. But when we're looking at these private interests, what they're doing is they're trying to, I guess, situate themselves where hopefully they believe the rules that they're setting up or the guidelines they're setting up would be the ones that become hopefully majority adopted, and that, they helped create the market space that we're looking at here. So, one of the things I'm looking at, for example, is the length of time these contracts exist. We're seeing some companies looking very short term. They're looking basically at annual contracts, knowing that that would fit very well with especially our farmers that rent land on an annual basis. Others are looking at this more from, let's call it the pure carbon perspective of going, we want long-term mitigation or sequestration. So they're looking at contracts that maybe are 10 years long, but that also includes some sort of 5 to 10 year look back as well, so that you're thinking about 15, maybe 20 years worth of carbon sequestration within that. So just, one little aspect here, the timing varies greatly, and you can imagine all the other little facets of these contracts that are varying from company to company.
That actually leads me to my next question too. That's perfect. So if you're a farmer, can you take out more than one contract? I think this is a common question I get from farmers at extension events too.
It is a common question. And again, I'm going to have to say it depends. I've joked, especially when talking about carbon, I often leave people with more questions than answers, just because a lot of it again, depends upon the company you're working with, the contract that they put in front of you. Some of these companies have been actively trying to make sure that their contracts are stackable so that they can be combined with other private initiatives. A lot of them are definitely trying to be stackable when it comes to any sort of government programs that might either exist now or coming down the line. Others still are like, no, we want this to be separate. We want to make sure that we're paying for carbon mitigation that's not already being captured or covered by some other aspect within the carbon market. So again, it does vary depending upon which company you're working with there. And I think a lot of this, again, goes back to they're all trying to feel out this space and figure out what the long-term market structure will look like within carbon.
Can you tell us, Chad, a little bit about the details? If you were a farmer or scientist, for example, how to find out about the contracts without reaching out to the company and having them send you a 20-page contract first? Is there like a one-stop shop, or are there, can you go to some of these websites and poke around and find details in their contracts?
Oftentimes you can. For example, I know group out of Illinois definitely poked around on several and brought together some of the details they were finding as far as some of the contract specifications. Each of the companies that I know of, I've been able to go out to their websites and at least glean certain pieces of their approach. For example, I know Indigo Ag has a website where they lay out, what their sort of strategy is in terms of developing a carbon market, a payment structure that they're putting out there. And they sort of have done a nice job of saying, okay, this is probably the maximum payments you could receive and how they see a typical farmer participating in that market. We've also are starting to see a lot of university extension systems trying to gather as much contract information as we possibly can to create some sort of comparable guidelines here, because I think that's the biggest challenge for farmers right now is they see these opportunities being talked about, our carbon markets and how there's building interest in them. But since there's not a lot of uniformity there, it does lead to, I guess I'll say, a lot of homework being placed on the farmer's shoulders to work through that contract once they get it from the company.
Sure, yeah. It's a learning process for me. I'm really learning a lot about these and finding good resources here and there. And Lisa and I have been sharing resources with each other. One thing I was wondering if you might comment on are some of the issues or controversies. Like maybe our audience isn't all familiar with the term additionality. And then one that's kind of near and dear to my heart is, since I'm a soil scientist, how are we going to validate and verify that carbon is actually being captured in these soils with different management practices?
Yep. So you start out with additionality, and I'd say that's a question that I hear a lot from farmers, especially our more like innovative farmers that have been very aggressive in developing, I guess I'll call it more carbon saving technologies over the past 5-10 years. Those that have been early adopters have made that move already, are now seeing these opportunities and going, well, can I get in on that? I've already done those practice changes. Can I enter into that contract? And for the most part, the answer is no. A lot of these companies are looking for what they call additionality, meaning that they're looking for changes from status quo today moving forward. And therefore, if you've made this move 5 years ago or 3 years ago, that's already in what they consider their baseline. And so they're looking for something additional beyond that. And I would say that is a fairly common feature of a lot of the contracts that we see. Not all of them. There are a few companies that I have heard of that are looking to reward farmers that have been more progressive that way and allow them to, if you will, sort of grandfather in. But as you look beyond that, the idea is you hit upon the validation piece. And with a lot of the companies that I've seen, the vast majority of them are using some sort of modeling to determine how much carbon is being held or the drop in emissions. And then, basically saying that, in some cases, the companies would look to validate by either doing some soil sampling or some additional modeling. In other cases, they're saying, no, if the farmer needs to validate this, then it's on the farmer's dime to do so. So you are seeing a big split there in terms of when it comes to validation, who's going to pay for it? How's it going to be done? That part of the contract seems to be vastly different depending upon which company I look at.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. Another word that you made me think about is, well, I guess it's a hyphenated word, is perverse incentives. I've heard a lot about, right? So not only the additionality idea, but maybe this carbon market might drive some of those early adopters, as you said, to go backwards for a few years so that they can start getting paid again. And again, as a soil scientist, we know that soils can degrade pretty rapidly when you have a major shift in a conservation practice. Have you heard anything about that, this kind of idea of perverse incentive?
Yes, from a farmer who has already, made that conservation practice move and going, well, if I backslide for a year, can I suddenly requalify? And again, the answer is it depends based on the contracts I have seen. Most of the companies have built in some sort of, I'll call it buffer phase, where they're asking not only for what you're doing today, but they're asking what you've done for the past 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So that if you had been doing this practice before, stopped for 1 year in order to qualify and then tried to re-enter again, they would look to block you here. So there are things that are built into most of these contracts that are trying to provide or avoid those perverse incentives here. And I think that, again, is a big question here because it goes along with the additionality argument. The idea is that how do these markets handle folks that did make those moves before this market existed?
Yeah, I thank you for teaching me another phrase around these carbon markets, the buffer phase. Or yeah, that's a good phrase. I had not heard that before. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, Chad, if you don't mind, and ask you about sort of specifics and issues with the contracts. Ask you a little bit about where you see the U.S. government role in these is. And I know one of the issues you mentioned earlier is kind of standardization. And what role do you see the U.S. government having in these carbon markets?
Well, I think we're seeing a big move out of Congress now. We're looking at, there's this, I'll make sure I get this right, Growing Climate Solutions Act of 2021. And what it basically lays out is what I sort of expect to see is that I think we're going to look for USDA, and especially from Congress, to say that USDA might be that entity that helps create some harmonization across the carbon market. What practices count? How do they count? Helping provide guidance in terms of verification of carbon holdings and creating I guess I'll call it a market platform off of which farmers might be able to participate in carbon markets. When you look at carbon, and the reason, again, another reason I refer to this as sort of like the Wild West is it reminds me of other markets that we've seen that had trouble developing and sort of holding firm until you had some structure put around it. And the one that it reminds me of most closely is probably the organic market within agriculture, where you had a lot of private companies selling themselves as organic, but there wasn't a definition for it. So consumers got confused about how to participate. It wasn't until USDA sort of came in, put a definition around it, and then you've seen that market flourish. And I think in this case, that's what the government is looking to do here, create that structure around carbon that will, like I say, harmonize how these activities, hopefully that these private companies can play into and that farmers can participate in as well.
Great, thanks for that. I'm actually going to ask you to scale up a little bit. So you just gave us a good explanation of the U.S. government's role, but what do you think the international role is, and maybe international organizations and just other economies, and how that would affect the U.S. carbon market?
Well, I think we're going to hopefully learn some lessons as well. If you're wanting to see probably the most active carbon market worldwide right now, it is in the European Union. Has been functioning for some time now, actually has an active futures market that trades so that farmers not only see, if you will, a price for carbon today, but they can also look out on this market and see future values or expected values of carbon as they look forward over time. That helps them make decisions in the longer run about their farming operation. And so, yeah, when you look at the European Union, they're a bit ahead of us in terms of developing these markets. But I think you're also seeing moves like with the Paris Climate Accords that recognize that, especially with a product like we're talking about here, you know, in dealing with carbon, it's not an issue that stops at the border. It is an issue that affects the globe worldwide here, and that we would need to have not only harmonization of rules around carbon here within the US, but we actually need sort of a global framework for this market to truly develop into the ways that we're looking for here.
Great. And so we're getting close to our time, direct conversation between you and me. I'm going to open it up to questions here in a moment. But before I do that, do you have any available resources or suggested resources that you might share with us all to find out more about carbon markets?
Sure. Probably the biggest one I'll point to right now is actually a brand new page that the Center for Ag and Rural Development has put together. So CARD here, for those that know the acronyms here on campus, they have just put together a carbon page. And what I really like that they did is they not only gathered up some recent information on carbon, you know, I guess I'll call it economic work over the past couple of years, but they actually went back all the way back into that first time frame, that 2008 to the 2010 time frame, to look at, you know, the papers that were produced there. And so they put this all in one handy dandy page, calling it their carbon page. And so that's a good one for that. Also looking forward, I think especially as we get more details on the contracts going forward, I would watch our Center for Ag Law and Taxation page. So it's known, again, acronym CULT in this case. But I know Christine Tigran and the staff there have been getting questions in from farmers, legal questions about these carbon contracts. And so you'll likely see some pieces coming out of CULT in the coming months about the laws around carbon. Specifically, they would concentrate on the legal aspects of these contracts. And then in my shop, we have the Ag Decision Maker website. So the idea is that, especially in dealing with any sort of decision tools that we might create for farmers as they're looking at these carbon opportunities, we will put them there. Now, right now, do we have a tool out there? The answer is no, because of the Wild West phenomena here. It's hard to build a tool around that yet. But I mean, especially if USDA starts to create some sort of harmonized product or a specific policy around this, we'll definitely put out some either at least fact sheets or decision tools on the Ag Decision Maker site.
Super. Thanks a lot, Chad. Azarun, I guess we're ready for questions.
Yeah, we have a few questions, and I am actually going to start with the one that says, can you, Chad, walk us through all the roles in a functioning carbon market?
All the roles, yeah.
Many different configurations. If you can start maybe with the simplest one and then maybe help us understand the roles in a more complex one.
Given that these, like I say, there's vastly different setups, it's hard to define specific roles, but I'll put it this way. From an ag perspective, the roles that we're looking at here, the farmer is being set up as a provider of carbon mitigation services. So oftentimes when we're talking about a carbon market here for agriculture, the farmer is being viewed as the individual that will be providing that carbon credit. They will either be reducing their emissions going forward by making some production practices or making changes on the land that would sequester carbon and hold it in the soil. Beyond that, we're probably looking at what we would call an aggregator. Now, in this case, these are a lot of these private companies I'm talking about, such as Nori or Indigo Ag. They would be the ones making the contract with the farmer, establishing that first trade, if you will, and helping establish that, yep, these practices or this carbon is being held on these farms, aggregating enough of those farms together that they could sell a package of carbon credits to customers down the line. Now, who those customers are down the line basically is any entity, company usually, that is looking to be able to say that they're reducing their carbon footprint by purchasing these credits and supporting carbon mitigation strategies within agriculture. And we've seen all sorts of companies be that customer in the back end. Walmart has purchased carbon credits. We've seen airlines that not only purchase carbon credits, but they'll even have that maybe as part of the ticketing process when they're working with their customers on the airlines. Do you want to purchase a carbon credit to offset your airline ticket? One of my favorite ones that I've been watching is actually Google. If you go to the Google main search page, if you look down on the bottom, they'll advertise that they've been carbon neutral since 2007. So we've got all sorts of different industries that can be customers within these carbon markets. At the same time, I guess I should point out, though, that other industries can also be creators of carbon credits as well. When you look at our carbon mix here across the US, while ag is a major portion at 10%, I believe it's roughly, I want to say 25% comes from the transportation sector. So when you look, I think there'll be opportunities for other industries and even individuals to possibly create carbon credits as we move forward. Ag is just right now being the ones that sort of being fixed on right now because it is a space where we have had some initiatives before. And we're also looking at, okay, what industry has access to the larger land base right now? And that would be agriculture.
Thank you. There's another couple of questions actually about, where are companies getting funds to pay growers? Where is the money coming, from into the system, sort of in this money exchange that's taking place?
Again, it's coming from a variety of places, but there are a lot of industries that are actively looking for these carbon credits. And like I say, they're advertising, you sort of see it in the advertising the businesses are doing, where they're talking about, we are looking to reduce our carbon footprint. And it seems to be part of the marketing campaign of a lot of different industries. And so I think there is money flowing out there already from the customer side to create some carbon credits out there. We're also seeing government interest here in helping create these carbon credits. In fact, in the run up over the past few months here, as the Biden administration has taken over, we're looking at them talking about the possibility of, for example, a carbon bank that would create a steady pool of funds to help farmers initiate some of these practice changes and, like I say, build some of the guidance here to help these markets flourish. So it's a variety of funding sources that are coming together to help get these markets off the ground.
Okay. So another question is, does there need to be a federal legislation in order to make these carbon markets or credits viable, with some farmers being skeptical of companies who are offering this kind of credits?
I'm going to say it's not absolutely necessary that the federal government has to do that. But I'm going to argue from my perspective, in order for these markets to become viable, yes, having government support and government guidance here is probably a necessary condition to success here. I think, without that government role here, we will have the same problems that we had last time when we looked at developing these carbon markets. We'll be, we won't find that harmonization. And without that harmonization, this market could die off fairly quickly again, just like it did before. Like I say, we had a run at it back in 2008 and 9. We did see some government legislation proposed, but a lot of that did not pass. Ended up that government support faded away, and as it did, so did the potential of the market. While I do believe there's more outside of government support for these markets, I think it still needs that government structure in order to truly be successful.
Shifting a little bit, what sort of carbon markets exist for grazers? And there's a follow-up question to that. Maybe I'll just go ahead and read the whole thing. So how will it work if a grazer was mobile and grazed on a row crop ground they didn't own, like through the Midwest Grazing Exchange? Who owns the credits then? Is it solely the row crop producer, or is it shared with the grazier? Or I guess grazier.
Okay. And again, I'm going to argue it depends. So, because in this case, as you say here, who captures this credit? One of the issues we've been looking at here is even within our row cropping systems here within Iowa, you're dealing with a lot of land that's rented out. And so who ultimately, if you will, owns the rights to that carbon? The way a lot of our crop laws are written, the renter owns what he or she produces within that year, but they don't necessarily hold on to that long-term ownership, especially if they're no longer renting after a year, let's say the landlord lets them go, they lose that ownership right. I think that's a big area of concern as we look at especially these longer term contracts within carbon. Because in order to sign these and for a renter to really gain from them, they need to know that they have a fairly ironclad hold on that land through the length of the contract. And I think when we're looking at grazers, we're looking at that same sort of thing. Grazers can participate. At least some of the companies have noted that they, for example, look at one of the ways to create a carbon credit is to look at rotational grazing or look at grazing density as we're looking out there. And anything that, again, reduces the carbon footprint of the herd that the grazer is, maintaining there can be utilized to create a credit. And so they can participate.
Thank you. We have a question here about to what extent are practices associated with nitrous oxide emission reduction incorporated in current carbon markets? We know
well, again, I'll go back to the idea of a carbon market. It talks about a ton of carbon dioxide or equivalent measures of other greenhouse gases. Okay. Nitrous oxide would be one of them. So it does get factored, it can participate here. I'll say it again, it does depend upon which company you're working with as to whether they're looking at just strictly carbon or whether they're looking at greenhouse gases as a whole. That does matter depending upon the company you're dealing with.
Chad, I have a quick follow-up about that actually. So does that mean like for our practices with nutrient or fertilizer management, would that count then for a carbon credit if it were reducing N2O emissions, for example?
It should. I think for some of these companies, it definitely would. The idea is that we're also seeing where some of these companies are saying they're looking at not only, let's call it the carbon footprint or the greenhouse gas footprint, but they're also looking at water quality aspects, for example. So there is this idea of it's not just a carbon market. We may be talking about a true ecosystem services market developing where you're not selling one particular good, or in this case, carbon, but you're selling a fleet of services, for the environment. And so that again is a place where we're seeing different companies target different things. Some are very specific. Others are a little bit broader in the either the practices that they will certify for the credits or the outcomes that they're looking to get from that credit. And I think that's one of the things I guess I should mention as well, that I think one of the biggest debates probably within USDA is how they set up the structure for a carbon market. For the most part, when it comes to our environmental programs, USDA has been very much practice driven. So looking at certain practices being done and making payments based upon the practices, as opposed to an outcome driven thing where we're actually measuring the carbon in the soil and how that's being, and I think that's one of the things that hopefully will come out as we move forward with USDA trying to harmonize here is, will this be a practice-based market or an outcomes-based market?
Chad, is there a place where vocabulary exists related to carbon for those who are sort of just trying to understand the roles and role players?
On that, I'm going to recommend, there have been a couple of pieces put out, and the best one I can point to is out of the University of Minnesota. A couple of colleagues up there, I think it's the Jung Yus and Cates. I don't remember their first name, so bear with me. But I know that they're basically, I think they're tied with the crops team at University of Minnesota. But they've written a really nice piece, introductory on carbon markets, and specifically sort of laid out some of the steps. And they've also done a great job of laying out a lot of the questions that an individual, especially a farmer, might ask as they're evaluating an opportunity in carbon, especially dealing with, these are the things to look for in that contract to make sure that you understand these aspects before you sign that contract. And I think I just saw Dana pop up the link to it in the chat. So thank you, Dana.
So sort of follow-up questions to, companies buying credits and claiming carbon neutrality. Is that verifiable in any way?
Well, I'd say it is somewhat verifiable, but again, I'll go back to when you look at each of these private initiatives right now, they each have different ways of verifying what they're selling as a carbon credit. So again, some of them are practice-based, and they can say, okay, we've paid for these practice changes, and they have the data, from the farmer to show that those changes did occur, validating in that way. Some of these contracts, though, do talk about the idea of verification of doing soil testing and actually measuring the soil carbon as a way to create that verification strategy. So there are verification strategies in play now. You can argue that, yes, they do verify those claims that exist today. But I think it's also the case of, depending upon where you bought that carbon credit from, there was a different verification process.
So in following up to sort of carbon credit purchase comment here, it doesn't necessarily reduce greenhouse, I believe GHG, greenhouse gas emission, correct? It just creates the opportunity to continue to emit. Is that correct?
Well, I would say this, it's saying that as a company, let's pretend, for example, I'm Walmart and I buy a carbon credit. What I'm doing is saying, okay, I may not be able to adjust my carbon footprint but I'm looking for ways to support where others can. So while I may not change my practice or change my carbon footprint, by purchasing this credit, I am providing money so that somebody else will reduce their carbon footprint. So in that sense, this is supposed to be a net positive. While the company that purchased the credit did not necessarily reduce their footprint, they did provide funding to make sure somebody else did reduce their carbon footprint.
Thank you. That's the questions we have for now. We have a comment here. It's critical that you noted the difference between practice versus outcome standards, that we probably need to improve our measures of soil carbon to employ outcome standards.
Yep.
And yeah, so.
And like I say, I know that is a big part of the internal debate that I've heard about within USDA. I think that is one of the major challenges that they're looking at here is that while we've done a lot of good science over the past, few hundred years actually, but especially on soil carbon over the past couple of decades, we've learned a lot about soil carbon and sort of how it evolves and moves. We're still also refining that. And I know a lot of the questions that I get from farmers have to deal with this idea of that a lot of these companies that are, providing this carbon credit opportunities are saying, we're going to model your practice change to translate it into some measure of carbon. So trying to measure that outcome. Yet the models can still be evolving. And so one of the questions farmers have had is, say the model does evolve and shows that my practice actually does not save as much carbon as we thought it once did. Who's responsible for that? What are the financial ramifications of that if I'm in the middle of my contract? And like I say, that's a major issue here for farmers, is that they do recognize that the science is not done here, that it is still evolving, that we're still learning about how carbon moves, not only through the soils, but throughout our atmosphere. And that, as those models improve, yes, we're getting better measures, but that can have financial impacts to them if they sign into these carbon markets.
Great, thank you so much. And this is actually a perfect time to stop. I'm going to turn it over to Marshall to wrap it up. And thank you so much for all the information that you've shared with us today. Go ahead, Marshall.
Yeah, thanks a lot for joining us, Chad. I always learn about, more terms, more phrases, more nuances as the wild west maybe becomes less wild as we learn more about this stuff. I want to thank everybody who joined us and asked some great questions as well. I thought this was a great conversation about carbon, and I'd also like to invite you to join us in our next few talks. So on June 2nd, we've got Dr. Frank Mitloner talking about a title, Path to Climate Neutrality in Livestock Production. So that will be on June 2nd at the same time, same place. I think it's the same link, that link there. And then on June 16th, we'll have Jill Eukin talking about a talk titled A Farmer and Ethanol Producer's Perspective on Carbon Sequestration. And we hope to see you at both of those next conversations about carbon. Thanks for joining us. And thank you again, Chad.
Thank you.